Hello, everyone, and this is a recording um, I'm making on Sunday afternoon. And this is a something that, uh, as the title suggests, John Bagot Glubb or Glubb Pasha, who was the um, uh, World War One veteran, and of course famously served in the Jordanian military. Um, Rank of general, and was widely respected in the Arab world today, particularly in Jordan. I saw a friend of mine, the Colonel Pride Review, who was on this channel. We did a two-parter series on the War of 1812, and he reached out to me and basically was saying, um, you know, uh, that this post and this thread was all over his um YouTube, his social media page, um and just wanted me to give it a go, have a look at it, and I'll see if I can try and bring it up here a sec. But this was from an account called John Wayne Tate, who is uh, apparently the founder of CLT, examination and grading. So he's obviously having something to do with the American education system, the grading for, what was it, like preschool? Now, I sorry, I don't mean to be third to 12th grade assessment. So what is that? Um, High school or something. I don't mid school. I don't know what the American schooling system is like, but anyway, um, and I'll just see if I can find it up here because it is uh yeah, sorry, back everyone. Sorry for the little blip. I had to pause it to find it. So this was a post by Jeremy Wayne Tate saying we are getting into uncharted waters, and so this is the um bit of, for him, that this is the controversy, is the dating system of the rise and fall of the empire. So you have the Assyrians, the Persian, um, uh, the Greek. So that this Persian one would be Cyrus, the Achaemenids, and the Greeks being the Alexander, and then his successor states, like the Seleucids and Ptolemy and uh, the Bactrian kingdom, so forth, a Roman Republic, and a couple, the ones that seem to be standing out the most, um, for people, it seems to be the Roman Empire, where the full date lies here at 180 AD, the Arab Empire, which dates at 880 880 AD, and then the Ottoman Empire, where the full date at 1570, um, and possibly the Spanish one as well. But these particular ones seem to be the most controversial because as you see below, even with the Grok intervention here, people are saying, well, this is just not true. Rome didn't fall in 180. And, someone here says, Ian Campbell puts here, this is rage bait. Um, and you have debates over, like, when did it fall? And someone even brings up the British Empire and all that sort of stuff. And I think one thing to acknowledge here is that Bagot Glubb wasn't necessarily a uh, historian, in the way that you would maybe look at Arnold Toynbee or as figures that I followed on my channel, like Charles Oman or figures like that. He is very much a military historian and also deep into political theory. My understanding, and I first came across uh, Bagot Glubb through Hitman, who now goes by B. de Britannia, and as well as Dr. Nima Parvini, aka Academic Agent, who covered um, the works of uh, Glubb in his book, The Prophets of Doom, particularly The Fate of Empires, which I think this is where there's a 3-volume one, but in particular, the book of Fate of Empires, which is um, where this image here and um, is taken from. So let's just break down really what he means here. In the Fate of Empires, um, there's this understanding that a society, the Imperium, the Imperial Society, its foundation and its sort of drive is that of conquest and ferocity, a warrior spirit society. And then empires would then disintegrate into mercantile behaviors in which it will naturally lead to a fall, but it also means, while yes, it exists on paper, it then suffers from the like constant chaos from within, that it can't function as as it once did during its golden age or heyday period. So let's just use one example here. Um, look at the Roman Empire. Now, yes, the Roman Empire didn't collapse in 180. It didn't fall in 180. But what did happen by 180 is the Julio Claudius dynasty ceased to exist. You had this period of where Roman emperors were, particularly, you know, after Commodus, were being murdered by their own Praetorian Guard or their own servants. You did have the rare occasion where I think Valerian was captured by the Sassanids, or um, I think one died of um, suicide and things like that. So you do have like the odd occasions where there would be sort of a natural death, but a lot of the times we know the Roman emperors were being killed off, and so you had this chaotic regime um, within the Roman Empire. And also by this point, the last bit of Roman conquest at its extent was under Trajan, and particularly with the capture of Mesopotamia, Armenia, and Dacia, which is modern day Romania. And in all cases, there you had that slow retreat, one across the Danube, where the frontier was the Danube itself, and then the Armenian mountain hills, Anatolian high plateau, and the deserts of the Levant became that sort of natural barrier of the Roman world, and there wasn't any further conquest or expansion. And in many ways, you could say all of these sort of harken to the end of expansionism within their respected societies. Um, as if you look at the end date, you could say that is what he's getting at, um, and totally disregarding the concept of any sort of mercantile or cultural innovation um, to that end. If we look at again remaining with the Roman Empire as well, at this point, most Roman legionnaires would have been killed in battle. Most Roman people killed in war would have been killed by other Romans um, by far. Probably second to that would have been the Parthian slash then would have been the Sassanids. So internally, it wasn't, Pax Romana wasn't. It was a uh, I would say relatively short-lived period, but you did have certain upswings. You could look at certain upswings in history, but um, in his time, in his concept that Glubb is getting at here, um, the spirit of the empire was over. It was gone. And, if you look forward, I know Iron Duke mentioned Justinian um, as sort of a counteract to this point, and I do accept that many might will disagree on the point being laid out here. But look at it from his point of view, the Roman Empire, right? It's from the Italic people surrounding Rome, the Romans. And what you have is with Justinian, effectively it's Greek, but it's not even just Greek. Justinian and Belisarius and a lot of the court are these sort of hybrid of Pannonian Greek, these Greeks from the Balkans, who the populations of the pre-Southern Slavic arrivals. Um, and so you do see again, you may say, well, actually Justinian is like it's a separate case because the people aren't these Latin Romans. Um, they are being, well, at this particular time they are under the governance of the Ostrogoths under the Goths, but and they have uh, and in that mix with Justinian, of course, you have like John the Armenian. You have several Armenian people. So on a civilizational level, it's um it's a different people. So that's one example. I think though where he may have a stronger argument, which people seem to disagree with, is the Arab Empire. Now, Bagot Glubb never he didn't cite much of his this is the problem you'll find. He didn't cite much of his work, but his knowledge of the Arab people and their history was quite vast and um, detailed, bearing in mind his connections to the Arab world and his sort of involvement, as I mentioned, with the Transjordanian, the Jordanian kingdom. And so it goes without saying that he probably has a better grasp on this. Now, when you look at the Arab Empire, what is he referring to here? He would be referring to in this the first caliphate, so the Rashidun Caliphate. This would have been the caliphate that burst out of Arabia um, during the Battle of Yarmouk, which defeated the Eastern Romans and conquered, Palestine, Syria, um, all the way up into Armenia and Egypt, and then uh, as well as conquering the entire Sassanid Persian Empire, except for the region in the northern um, mountainous regions near the Caspian Sea region. The second empire in this, within the the second movement was the Umayyad Caliphate, and they would go on to stretch into Central Asia, um, Cyprus, Crete, and also more importantly, the remaining bits of Roman North Africa. So, modern day Libya, Tunisia, Carthage would fall, and Morocco. And and then the second iteration of this was the Abbasids, the Abbasids uh, faction and house, which would then go on to effectively through a revolution and a civil conflict take over, and this would be the final iteration of an Arab empire, if you could call it that. In fact, the funny thing is that with the Abbasids, it's sort of uh, more it goes against that notion, but and the Umayyads, the sort of rump of the Umayyads would then go on to conquer Spain from the Visigoths. And so with uh, Glubb's understanding of this, this empire, the Arab empires, its spark, its civilizational spark, was its incredible conquests, largely down to a weakened Eastern Roman and Sassanid societies, which had both been at war, had gone through a smallpox epidemic known as the believed to be smallpox through the Justinian plague, um, and large bits of territory being passed from the Sassanids, who would conquer um, uh, Egypt from the Romans, uh, Palestine and Syria, and then return to. And so, the land and territory had been at war, elements that were sort of depopulated, but also had been in a sort of series of constant flux. And from this warrior groups of class who uh, it's like a religious warrior class, springed out of the sprung out of the Arabian desert to conquer with such ferocity, um, that they were unstoppable, particularly against the ancient Persians and the might of the Roman world. And from Glubb's perspective, the reason why he chooses 880 is with the Abbasid revolution, effectively, it was also a coalition of um, non Arab Muslims, even some Christians, Zoroastrians were involved, or crypto Zoroastrians, if you want to believe some of the accounts and everything. Um, it was a whole mix to uh, go to take down the Umayyads, sort of Arab sort of control. Now, looking back at this, you could say the Arab Empire. And why doesn't he call it the Islamic Caliphates? Why does he refer to it as Arab empires or Arab Empire? From the Rushden Caliphate and the Umayyad Caliphate, it was Arab. It was centrally. It was from both groups were houses and groups. The Rushdans claim direct following descendant from their prophet, same as the Umayyads, and it was like a explicitly Arab empire. That at the heart of their empire was the own sort of ethno nationalistic inclination. And this was borne out through how their societies were run. So, for example, when they would conquer, take the Russian Caliphate, when they conquered the Levant and Syria, Palestine, and the Persian, Iranian world, they never, um, at any point, wished to convert vast numbers of people to Islam. In fact, you would have cities, particularly in you would have cities where Arabs would be moved into, both in the sort of Greco-Roman conquered lands and the Persian conquered lands. But there was never any great push, and in fact, it was the opposite, because the non-Muslim tax, as the jizya, would be highly beneficial for the caliphates, and it would be highly beneficial for there to be many Christians and many Zoroastrians, um, as they would be required to pay tax. So there was a huge financial uh, sort of inclination that this did change under the Umayyads, where you would have more, Persians and maybe like Arabs in sort of like the the Greco-Roman world, particularly in the Zoroastrians who and Iranians who would convert to Islam, and you would see, um, with the rise of the Abbasids, the center of sort of control would be shifting, changing all over the place. So in the rise, you had new cities that sort of sprung up, like Baghdad and Cairo, particularly Baghdad, which would be the sort of capital of of the Abbasids, but the Umayyads, their capital would be in Damascus. The decline, so to speak, would be the sort of halt of um, not just of Islamic conquest into Europe, but also their change from a martial power into more mercantile um, behaviors, particularly with how they view each other within the empire and different groups. What you see at this particular time in the 880s and 880 is the start of what's called the Iranian intermezzo, where Iranian individuals, like within the Abbasids previously in the previous century, um, converted to Islam and started to outperform the Arab population, and also um, bringing the Iranian civilization and culture into the Arab world. So we all know about the Baghdad House of Wisdom, and a lot of like Reddit tier liberals and Reddit tier historians get very excited because they like to paint Europe as this and the European peoples as this sort of backward society, and that the Arab world and the Muslim world was this sort of haven of knowledge. Well, the sorry to disappoint everyone, but the Baghdad House of Wisdom, while it was a school and definitely a place of learning for Arabs and people within the caliphate, it was in reality a house of translation. They would translate Greek, works of Roman, of Persian, of Indian, and others into Arabic. And sure, there was differences, maybe poems and stories, names of people and places and stuff would change, but at the heart of it, it was translations. Much of the science and mathematics would be translated into Arabic. And so from that, from Glubb's point of view, the uh, this signaled a decline, and it did because from within, after the Abbasids, various provincial, regional governors and powers started to break away. Um, though technically not, because and then this is the sort of a difficult thing to grasp, is the Abbasids still existed as a political entity until the Mongols arrived in the 13th century, when it was the Abbasids were like the seat of Sunni Islam. They were the uh, protectors of Sunni Islam. Um, I mean, technically the Abbasid Caliph would sort of go on centuries after, maybe in sort of as like a spiritual figurehead in Cairo, and so you're looking towards the rise of the Ottomans at that point. But it the Abbasid sort of state itself did continue up until that point. Um, and so I would, well, looking at this, you can't measure the fall of an empire based on its geographical landmass and um, its material presence uh, in the world at that point. Because looking at this, you actually have to look of how it was spiritually, how its people understood and viewed themselves, how they thought of themselves at this point, and um, the wider context of all empires begin as martial because you have to be. No empire's ever won itself through you know ideas of freedom or mercantile practices. Even the current empire, the sort of American empire, that there was that foundation was built on force. It was built on force from World War II and various uh, aspects after World War II, though you can measure its success rate, but it still requires physical force in some capacity. Um, I will talk about maybe I'll talk about and the Ottoman Empire, 1570. You're looking at the height and the end of its conquest. Now, I know, of course, you have the century later, you'd have the last invasion of Hungary and Austria against the Habsburgs, but again, expansionism. And then beyond that point, Ottoman Empire was just known as the sick man of Europe. It would be sort of limping along, slowly losing territory to independence movements in the Balkans and then to Arab nationalist movements later on. Um, I mean, again, the Romanov Russia. I mean, that's a sound end date because 1916. Following year, you would have the revolution. Spain, Spain became quite a sort of a weakened empire by that point. Was conquered by Napoleon's the French Empire under Napoleon, required a great deal of assistance from Britain. And of course, the British Empire, again, a good example of what I'm talking about here is technically in 1950, Britain's empire still existed. I mean, sure, we didn't have India. We lost India a few years earlier, but we still had colonies in Africa, in the Pacific, parts of Asia, and in the Caribbean. So, technically as well, we still had parliamentary sort of sovereign control. UK's parliament was still um, had some sort of power and control over the other Canadian parliaments and um, the Australian, New Zealand parliaments. One thing actually, while I remember this, Glubb compared the British Empire to the Arab Empire and in some of its practices. Now, in Britain, and in the late 19th century, in the 1860s, you had the Dominion status for Canada, where the colonies of Canada were united and as a Dominion, and then you would have the same being to Australia, New Zealand, and then of course South Africa. So this would be the colonies, the actual colonies, not imperial territories, but colonies of British, Anglo-British people settled there. The exception being, of course, in Africa, where that was a sort of reaction to the Boer War. But um, in those areas, they'd be given Dominion status, so there would be you would have like a uh, in some arguments maybe like a siphoning off of the empire or formalizing it as its own separate entity. And this happened, as Glubb points out. He talks about this with the Arab Empire, with the likes of Khorasan in eastern Iran, which would become its own military and political hub. And there was also the same was the Abbasids did the same as well in Egypt. Um, and this is a way of, I guess, arguing from that perspective. Um, it was a way of how it weakened itself internally deliberately because it was just based on an administrative convenience, not about the greater society itself. Um, and of course, as we see today in Canada and Australia and New Zealand, you have forces in place now, not so much maybe 50, 60, 70 odd years ago, where there was a largely homogenous society who could say, well, we are British Australia, we're fundamentally from the British people. And now they've sort of, through actions of certain actors within their own states, trying to create this new separate identity. It is worth mentioning, though, of course, the Arab and the Iranian stuff have always been a separate one. And this is something maybe where I disagree with Glubb, but it was on the nature of the supremacy of Islam, which was the central core pillar of this state, of these of this these the Arab Empire was of course Islam, And so instead, the Khorasan, the military garrison, the famous military garrison stationed in Baghdad at this time, and the recruitment and the generals from this region in Iran then became the swords and the defenders of Islam. It was no longer the Arab people out of Medina or Mecca. Um, and so that's really what he's getting at, is that the actual center, the sort of spiritual and political military center, it gets confused, it gets like shifted about a bit. Um, and I think the problem is the people in this thread and the person, they, people like certainty and confirmation of dates. Like on this particular date, it just all fell apart. And as we know, as people of historians, people watching this who are into history, know that that isn't simple. There's a date when the Roman legions left Britain, but we accept that, the day that the Roman legions left, in what 410 or whatever, it's not like as soon as that last boat left the shores, um, Roman Britain didn't just like stop immediately then. There was a gradual process, and then of course the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons. And it's the same with, the Roman Empire. Beyond 180, you would then have the crisis of the third century. You would then have, which normalized the splitting up of the empire into a more formalized tetrarchy. You would then have the adoption of Christianity as a state religion, and then of course the arrival of the barbarians. Um, and this is the fall. This is where 180 marks the point of where the empire is in a. I mean, you could say all of this represents a point where the empire goes from being an aggressive power to an explicitly defensive power, and retreats within itself. Um, 1950, you can definitely apply that to Britain. Um, in the Romanov-Russian Empire, that was more extreme. That was an extreme version of all this, where it did like straight up collapse, but it collapsed with in itself, um, because you had, of course, the revolution, and then the Bolshevik Revolution straight after, because the supposedly moderate liberal republic that formed briefly collapsed because of, the sort of vanguardic nature of the Bolsheviks. So that's how I would define it, and I think this is, the people in the chat here in there were not happy. They obviously prefer simplistic um, reasons, simplistic um, definitions of this, and you know, I would say to everyone to check out the Fate of Empires if you want a clear understanding, or even just pick up Prophets of Doom and look at that chapter on that, because that does talk about it. It's very much in the sense of Spengler's cyclical theory, a lot of cyclical theories. The idea that there's like a 250 year sort of trajectory of empires, maybe 300 years, is true. When you look at the expansionist nature of empires, and then the sort of mercantile and then recline and fall. Um, we've all seen that meme of like, Rome burning in the background, and it's, you know, um, what was it? Strong men and create good times, and weak men and all that sort of stuff. I mean, it's sort of like that's a very simplistic version of that, but yeah, I'll keep it short like this. So that's just my take on this. You may disagree. I imagine there'll be people who will disagree on this and still not really get what this was about, but why it's important is. But there we go. All I can say is, this was sort of Glubb's understanding of it, and I think it's helpful to understand definitely like humans, how societies behave. It's a good analysis of societal behavior, and how imperial societies behave. And um, Yeah, that's all I have on that. So thank you everyone for watching. I'll probably upload this on Monday, so you'll be watching this on Monday. And in the meantime, go well and see you all then.